On November 14th, just a couple weeks ago, the Norwegian government issued a formal apology as well as a set of 17 resolutions designed to reconcile with the forced assimilation of the Sami, Kven, and Forest Fin peoples, the indigenous peoples of Norway before the current settlers moved in. Now, this is already a complex scenario, but in order to fully examine both the atrocities of the assimilation as well as the effectiveness of the reconciliation, I'm going to be using Berenstein's model for civil and civility to understand how epistemological violence affected this scenario. The situation begins in the 15th and 16th centuries when the people who are now Norwegians took Sami and Ken lands, relocated the people, and used the lands for farming. Apparently, they weren't content with just taking the lands of the people and instead decided to use a forcible suppression of both their language and culture as authorized by the government. This is comparable to the erasure of Gaelic culture in Ireland and the civilizing of the indigenous people in North America. This assimilation extended to every single part of the indigenous people's lives. The Norwegians put them into boarding schools to make them learn to be more civilized, use religion to erase their culture and values, forced them to learn Norwegian, eradicating their own languages, controlled where they lived by both relocating them and reusing their land, and finally, they even removed children from their parents and put them with Norwegian families in an effort to make the kids Norwegian from the get-go. Now, if we use the template from Berenstein's Civility and the Civilizing Project, we can see the true extent of the violence that settler colonial people placed on them. See, based on this model, the concept of civility and being civilized is used by settler colonials in order to kind of quell dissent and also naturally place their way of life as the correct way of life. So by putting indigenous people in boarding schools, changing their languages, erasing their culture, erasing their religion, and controlling where they lived, the settler colonists are effectively controlling every aspect of the indigenous people's lives, taking away what makes their lives unique and reframing everything into a settler colonial mindset. See, they're doing this at every step of the way. Now, one thing I really want to highlight right here in terms of how they were civilized is what Ruiz breaks down as a zero-point epistemology, where something that is indigenous or not something that's not from the settler colonial mindset is sort of reshaped with settler colonial terms, and all of a sudden people are trapped even in the very language that they use. Now, a really effective way they did this is both changing the language of the indigenous people, so now they have to think and act and live in a verbal framework that does not suit their values. And in addition to this, the settlers retook the indigenous land and repurposed the entire farming, changing the entire usage of the land. This is a very direct reference to both saying that the indigenous ways are faulty and the settler colonial ways are superior and better, they're civilized, they're improved. This just kind of enforces a sort of societal hierarchy and acts as an almost justification for the settlers' actions. Now, civility, in addition to covering up the atrocities done to indigenous people, is also used in a more sinister way to sort of reinforce a more benevolent view among the native populace. Now, a 2021 survey revealed that over 60% of Norwegians knew little to nothing about the forced assimilation policies. This is what Berenstein would call cultural gaslighting, where we take a brutal, violent view of history and instead replace it with something that makes it look more palatable, such as referring to the land as wilderness when there's actually quite a lot of people there, and again referring to people as uncivilized so you can justify bringing them civility. Ultimately, the Norwegian forced assimilation, or Norsification, followed the same pattern of cultural erasure and gaslighting that Berenstein highlights, with the justification of civilizing the natives being all too present. Now, unfortunately, we've seen this trend before. This is the by-the-book method of proper settler colonialism. You not only take the lands, but you take the people, and with those people, you take their culture, you take away everything about them until the only way they can exist and think and feel and write and express themselves is within a framework that works to your benefit. So now that we've discussed the forced assimilation of the native people, let's take a look at the Norwegian government's approach to the reparations, both what I think they did right and what I think they did wrong. So, following a report done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2023, the Norwegian government has offered an unreserved apology to all minority groups affected by the Norwegianization policies, forceful re education, relocation, and assimilation that began codified in 1851 and continued up until the 1980s. One thing I think they did really well is the Commission proposed a Center for Knowledge, Research, Dissemination, and Reconciliation that should be created, and it calls for institutions of all sectors of society to look into how they can contribute to reconciliation. Now, I really like this because it invites a lot of additional viewpoints that can destabilize the hegemony of the settler colonial ideal, with more worldviews and ideas regarding how the indigenous ought to be treated. This may lead to an eventual downfall of settler colonial ideology, or at the very least, cause enough people to question its legitimacy. In addition to this, the government of Norway outlined 17 resolutions to address ongoing discrimination, and that includes protecting minority languages and even ensuring that children, indigenous children, are taught the culture of their parents. Now, this appears to me like a step towards decolonization, sort of removing the settler colonial hegemony and allowing people to use their own language and culture and expression again. So, why isn't this enough? While the Norwegian government has allowed the indigenous peoples to use their languages and has encouraged education of their languages and culture, they still have done absolutely nothing to address the use of land and water rights, which is the source of the most strife between the indigenous people and the government. Now, this is only a partial or kind of simulated decolonization. The indigenous people are being granted the right to practice their own language again, but within a settler colonial society. There are material conditions that dictate their quality of life and preservation of their culture, namely their access to and autonomy surrounding their land, food, and water, is still controlled by a settler colonial system. So while this appears to bring forth a lot of progress, the indigenous people are still very much stuck within a system that oppresses them. Both Berenstein and Ruiz are very clear about how decolonization is not metaphorical, it is a literal returning of land to indigenous people and minority groups. So here, not returning control over land and water, still affecting their ways of life, but saying, hey, you can use you can use your own languages again, yay! It's sort of a hollow victory. It's not a proper solution. It's only really solving part of the problem. So ultimately, when we view the Norwegian government's actions with Berenstein's civility ideals in mind, we see the true horror that was done by the assimilation and also how a lot of their reconciliation seems to fall short.